We'll now demonstrate a start of the APU when the aircraft is parked and has normal electrical power provided from an external source. We assume that you've configured the aircraft with normal electrical power, the external power blue on light is illuminated, and you've just performed your pre-flight walk-around inspection. Okay, you're back on the flight deck. The APU start requires you to select two switches on in sequence. First, turn on the APU master switch. Verify that the blue on light illuminates in the switch and that the ECAM APU page is automatically displayed. Watch the ECAM APU page. When the APU air inlet flap is full open, the green flap open indication will appear. If the flap does not open, the APU will not start. Next, to initiate the APU start sequence, press the APU start push button. Note, if you push the APU start button before the flap is open, the start sequence will not begin until the flap is fully open. The blue on light illuminates in the APU start switch to indicate to the crew that the automatic APU start sequence has begun. The starter comes on first, then the ignition and fuel are sequenced to on. At 60% N, the starter cuts out, and shortly thereafter the ignition is automatically de-energized. You can observe the APU spool up on the ECAM APU page by watching the N, or RPM, and EGT rise. When the N of the APU reaches about 95%, the blue on light in the APU start push button will extinguish and the green available light will come on. The illumination of the green available light occurs simultaneous with an available indication on the ECAM APU page and an APU available memo on the EWD. These indications inform the crew that the APU operation is normal and both electrical power and bleed air from the APU are now available. Normally, the ECAM automatically displays the next expected page as you complete a task. Therefore, in a normal sequence of events, once the APU operation is normal, the ECAM door page automatically replaces the ECAM APU page after about 10 seconds. This normal sequence of ECAM pages allows the crew to verify the closing of the aircraft doors before pushback. However, if you want to continue to view the APU parameters, you'll need to select the ECAM APU page. So press the APU switch on the ECAM control panel. Okay, notice the displayed items on the ECAM APU page, especially the generator displays. Ensure the APU generator switch is selected to on. Notice that all parameters are normal, but the APU generator is not online. The APU generator will not automatically pick up the electrical loads. You must turn off the higher priority electrical source for the APU generator to come online. To accomplish this, you must turn off the external electrical power by pressing the external power switch. When the APU generator is powering the aircraft, the display on the ECAM APU page displays as shown. On this frame, you can select the external power switch on and off to observe the display change on the ECAM APU page. To turn on the APU bleed air, press the APU bleed push button. Notice that the blue light in the switch comes on when the switch is on. The selection of APU bleed to on provides APU air to the system. A check valve is installed in the output of the APU bleed air to ensure that another source will not back pressure the APU. With the APU bleed on, you can view the bleed operation on the ECAM APU page. When the APU bleed switch is on and bleed air is available, the APU bleed valve will open and the APU available memo is replaced with APU bleed. Now on this frame you can select the APU bleed switch on and off to observe the display change on the ECAM APU page. Okay, we have the APU electrical power and bleed air supplied to the aircraft. You can continue with your other pre-flight duties. Normally, you'll keep the APU operating until after the engines have been started. In some cases, the crew may keep the APU operating for takeoff to provide bleed air to operate the packs. In this case, you'd leave the APU bleed switch on. This situation allows for a no-engine bleed takeoff when improved takeoff performance is required. For today, we'll demonstrate shutting down the APU after engine start. Recall the location of the APU air inlet. You may consider turning off the APU bleed air as soon as possible after engine start to avoid ingesting engine exhaust gases which could find their way into the air conditioning system. Since the APU is equipped with an automatic cool-down cycle, if APU bleed air has been in use prior to shutdown, the APU will continue to operate for 60 to 120 seconds to allow for proper cooling. In any event, you'll normally turn off the bleed air before turning off the APU. This action will close the APU bleed valve, and the engine bleed valves will open to continue the supply of bleed air to the pneumatic system. So, turn off the bleed air by selecting the APU bleed push-button switch to off. As soon as the switch is turned off, the APU bleed memo on the EWD changes to APU available. The display on the ECAM APU page indicates the closure of the APU bleed air valve. The APU is equipped with an automatic cool-down cycle. If the APU bleed air was in use before shutdown, the next step may or may not shut down the APU immediately, depending on the required operating time for cooling of the APU hot section. Select the APU master switch to off and notice that its blue light extinguishes and the available light in the start push button also goes out. Depending on the cool-down cycle, the APU will shut off at the appropriate time, which could be after a delay of 60 to 120 seconds. Now, during the cool-down cycle, the APU available memo remains in view. If you change your mind and want to interrupt the shutdown cycle for continued APU operation, you can select the APU master switch back to on as long as the APU available memo is in view. If APU bleed was not in use prior to selecting the APU master switch to off, the APU will immediately shut down. After the APU shuts down, the APU available memo blanks, and the flap open indication on the ECAM APU page blanks to indicate the flap is closed. Well, this completes our demonstration of an APU start and shutdown during normal operations. The same basic sequence of events is used to start and shut down the APU in flight. We'll now demonstrate an APU start when the aircraft is not normally powered. While the procedure is basically the same, the indications will be reduced since the aircraft only has battery power and the ECAM is not operating. Assuming the external power light is out and only the battery power is on, select the APU master switch to on. Observe the on light illuminates in the switch. You have to assume the APU flap is opening because there's no ECAM display. Select the APU start switch to on and observe the blue on light comes on. The APU will start with no other indications. When the RPM of the APU reaches 95%, The Start On light goes out and the Available light comes on. At this time, the APU generator will automatically come online and the ECAM will be powered. After about 10 seconds, the ECAM APU page will appear and you can adjust the brightness of the ECAM display as necessary on the ECAM control panel. Remember that after about 10 seconds, the ECAM door page automatically replaces the ECAM APU page. Well, this completes our demonstration of an APU battery start. Now, let's answer some questions about this module.